So welcome everybody. It's still early in the morning, but we are in for a very exciting lecture. This series of lectures is something entirely new at the university campus. And it's not by coincidence, because this year happens to be the year of internationalization at the University of Oslo. We are also pleased to let you know that we have chosen for today's lecture one of the most prominent and skilled experts in history at the University of Oslo, Knut Kjelstadli. I think that Knut has found a very good title, a striking title, The Nation State in the Age of Globalization, Stone Dead or Rejuvenated. Knut, it's a pleasure for me to ask you to take the floor, and we are looking forward to a fascinating lecture.
Well, the Norwegian scholar Johan Galtung once remarked that when the English have spread the language all over the globe, they have to accept that people do funny things with it. So here we go. Global migration is here to stay. Population growth, economic inequalities in the world, persecution on religious, political or other grounds, and also the effects of climate changes. All these powerful forces, they pull in the direction of migration. And this is not something that can be easily, so to speak, turned off. And the result will be more complex societies with minorities, with de facto multicultural populations. And this is not a transitory state, but this is the necessary starting point for any kind of reasoning, whether we like it or dislike it. We have to live simply in a world with difference and manifold. So, my question is, how do we cope with this situation? And one answer offered is more or less implicit in the title for this series of lectures. That is the idea of global citizenship. Now, of course, this may be understood as a kind of attitude, as a kind of noble dream, as a kind of regulative idea. But there are also those who are opting for global governance and cosmopolitanism in a quite concrete sense as a feasible alternative within a fairly foreseeable future. And the reasons for this, that are given for this, are partly positive. In the sense there's a belief in humankind, there's a belief in brotherhood, there is a belief in subjugating politics to an international regime of human rights, and there is a hope for a kind of eternal peace. Eternal peace, eviger friden, was also sort of the vision that Immanuel Kant had way back in 1795. There are also other reasons offered for global governance, which might be called negative, in the sense that the alternative, the nation states, they are seen as more or less obsolete, and to the extent that they still exist, they are seen as a problem, as detrimental. And according to this view, this critical view, nation state is too large, problems should be dealt on with a local level, and simultaneously the nation state is seen as too small a unit, because problems like pollution, global warming transcend all national borders. And it's also, in a way, the nation state is seen not only as too small, but as too narrow. There is a sense in a tendency in nation states to homogenize, to delete difference and manifold. Now, this is one view. I must warn you that my argument runs in a somewhat different direction. I do, of course, agree that in the name of the nation, atrocities have been and are being done. That nations may be perpetrators, and the situation in Balkan is just one of many examples. I do agree that there's much to regret on policies on minorities, and I do, of course, agree that there are appalling examples of nation states that deny access to people who are in dire straits, be it the Jews before World War I, or be it the modern refugees today. And there are social scientists, such as the Polish-American Zygmunt Bauman, who claim that control and making things homogeneous, that is a kind of inherent in, and is also particular to, the nation state. I think this is not historically correct. For also the kind of state that preceded the nation states, the so-called dynastic states built on around the person of the king, they tried very hard to exert border control. But their organizational and their technological capacity was more modest than the modern nation state. And these dynasties, be it the Oldenburg dynasty in Denmark, then they ruled over states that were multilinguistic, multi-ethnic, and sometimes multi-religious. But these empires, which is the correct name for them, be it the Oldenburg, the Denmark mini-empire, be it the Habsburgs, be it the Romanovs in Russia, the Ottomans in Turkey, they were not at all generally tolerant and lenient. They might have been non-nationalist in the sense that it was possible to come and be a subject to the prince. But they were unswervingly heavy-handed when it came to the migrant poor. Poor were always rejected and ejected. And poverty, not religion or nationality, that was the worst sin, to be poor. And so seeing the nation state as the kind of master culprit is simply not correct. I shall return to this theme of nation states, but let us first look a bit closer at the alternative, a system of global governance in a world society. There are world federalists and cosmopolitans that claim that general human rights and other types of rights already have substituted and also should substitute national citizenships. They say we are already into, or at least we are approaching, what is called a post-national condition. Now, to my mind, the problem with this description, this kind of reasoning, is the following. In order for rights to be maintained, there have to be institutions that can uphold these rights. And so far, I think it's hardly unfair to say that the world state does not exist. Then there is another expression, the world society, which is often used, often in connections as the world society cannot tolerate this so and so, or the world society has to intervene in such and such a country. But the problem is, to my mind, that there is no world society. If we by society means a unit that is fairly objectively interwoven, that is fairly integrated, and also subjectively shares a set of common categories and norms. So in practical reality, I think the term world society is often used as a kind of ideological shorthand for the present ruling global power constellations. And that is one problem. And there's a second problem, and that is the following. Thinking about a future global unity has not yet, to my mind at least, solved the problem of a democratic basis for a future world state. And much of the literature on global governance, it deals with various types of managing the world, the management of the world. That may be under the leadership of a superpower, an empire or a hegemon, but the point is that within this system, so far, it seems that the balance tips in favor of social and political elites. They are able to organize globally much more easy than the ordinary man and woman. So this is maybe, at least, a world governed not by democratic systems, but governed by, let's say, the World Economic Forum in Davos, or the International Monetary Fund, or the World Bank. And neither has such a world state solved the problem of rallying a certain emotional warmth from the populations, which I think any state is dependent on. There is a bit ironic characterization or cosmopolitanism. It's been called the class consciousness of the frequent traveler. And as we know, the ordinary men and women, they do not travel that much, at least if they do not belong to a Norwegian very wealthy society. So there are also those who have foreseen what could call a global civil society. A society where non-governmental organizations, NGOs, are supposed to represent the population. And this may be a bit idealistic way of reasoning, because it presupposes that norms, standards, and self-imposed ethic guiding rules will make questions of power and opposing interests to be of little importance. It's the belief in the rule of the norm is a bit distray when it comes to the question of power. And of course, NGOs may sometimes also be rather self-serving. So there is in this idea about a world society, a world state, a lack of realistic bids on how humanity may become so socially integrated that it may carry these universal cosmopolitical norms. A world parliament has been suggested. It does not seem it's around the corner. And in saying this, I want to be clear about that. I do not want to make light. I don't want to be ironic about the UN and UN organizations. They do have their value, definitely. However, to this day, it is difficult to see alternatives to nation states that are both realistic and inclusive. And if we then go back to the nation states, there are signs, definite signs, that they are not out of history. Because historically, nation states are a fairly modern phenomenon. Out of 30 states in Europe in 1989, 17 had been founded after 1906. And all the states in the world at large, in 1989, 99 out of 165 had been constituted after 1946. And we see that many states, such as East Timor, Slovenia, and recently Kosovo, they are formed after 1989 as well. And in Scotland, one speaks about devolution. I do not mean this as a kind of argument that is the correct way to proceed, but it is a fact that nation states are being created as we speak. And more particularly, I remind you of the fact that the strongest singular power in the world in the last decennia, that is the United States of America, is a nation state. So there has been given another picture, that is that today there is a kind of empire, it's a kind of global network comprising all and everything, lacking though a center. And I think this idea about empire offered from the left, or some left thinkers, it does not cover the situation. Because it's contradicted by the way the American state has operated militarily, technologically, and economically. And we also see that states within the EU, they definitely look out for their own interest. I mean, try to telling a Greek that today that he shares nationality with Germany, or vice versa, for that matter. In parts of the upper educated middle class, also in Norway, it has become chic to pour irony over nisselue, peasants, norskinger, also among persons who would never speak derogatorily about hijab or campesinos, or never would speak about tyskinger. And that's maybe they do feel like this, but the point is that one has to accept that people, many people have a positive feeling towards the nation to which they feel they belong. And when people do hold these traditions there, I think it should not be brushed off just as a kind of mistake, but be seen and understood as a help for men and women to orientate themselves in the world. And in the words of the American social scientist Craig Calhoun, both roots and the need for roots are asymmetrically distributed. It is often those lacking wealth, lacking elite connections, and lacking the ease of movement who find the membership in solidaristic social groups most important as an asset. And this is so whether the groups are communities, crowds, ethnicities, nations, or religions. End of quote from Calhoun. And so I think those who say about the nation state, they may say as, we have to say about the nation state as the American author Mark Twain should have said when he saw his own death notice. He sent a note, "The rumors of my death are considerably exaggerated." So not only do nation states exist, but it seems that they are needed. Once more, in the words of Craig Calhoun, there is the nations provide for structures of belonging, that build bridges between local communities and mediate between these and globalizations. Nations organize the primary arenas for democratic political participation. Nationalism helps mobilize collective commitment to public institutions, projects, and debates. Nationalism encourages mutual responsibility across divisions of class and region. And then he added, we may doubt both the capacities of nation-state and the morality of many versions of nationalism, but we do lack realistic and attractive alternatives. So I think there are fairly strong reasons that there will be no real world society and no world state around the corner. And I also think there are some valid reasons, also on moral grounds, to believe that nations and nation-states will continue to exist. And as I believe this is true, I now shift my theme. I want to ask, what kind of nation do we need in order to cope with these kind of complex societies produced by global migration? What kind of nation do we need in the world today? And my claim then is that none of the historically established models of nation is able to meet the challenges of today's world. And I should try to explain why this is so. And because I do believe this, I'll also try to offer an outline or another way of thinking about nation, another understanding of what we do mean by saying, when you say we in Norway, or Norwegian, or Norwegians. Now then, what is a nation? Or what may a nation be? And historically, there are two main answers given in Europe. The first is the idea that a nation is primarily a cultural nation. And according to this view, a nation is built around a common historical core. The people carry some significant, distinguishing, and stable qualities. They are imbued with, in the old days, we used to be called a Volksgeist, a people spirit. And once created, these qualities were built into the people through social institutions, culture, and language. This concept of culture, it understands culture as a kind of primeval, everlasting entity, an entity which is externally very clearly demarcated and internally rather homogeneous. And also an entity that is unique compared to other cultures. And finally, there is this view that culture is the force that informs and directs the actions of those belonging to this culture. We may also see sometimes that culture is mixed with or substituted with the idea of biological race. For instance, in 1910, the Norwegian Central Bureau of Statistics, they wrote in the census that along with Norwegians and Sami people and the Kveni people up north, there were also Danish and Swedish races. So the Danes were another race than the Norwegian. That's the way of thinking. Well, anyway, in both varieties, cultural and biological points of view on the state, the origin is the decisive factor. Those who came to the territory later, they might more or less be assimilated, and yet something inferior clung to those who came later. And this ethnic concept of the nation as Kulturnation, has been called a German concept and has been linked to a view of citizenship linked to the right of blood and ancestry, what is called the jus sanguinis. And the reason is you are German or Norwegian because you are born German or Norwegian. And the other concept of nation, the so-called political nation, that has been dubbed French. And the decisive question has been loyalty to the political common cause, not the ethnic background. The nation in this way of thinking is understood as a kind of also consisting of those individuals who are willing to join the state and abide by the laws of the state. So the nation is primarily a political nation. And this model opens for becoming French or Norwegian, and at the same time signaled a very strong expectation to newcomers that they had to assimilate. At least that what they brought along, their cultural baggage, had no validity in the public sphere. You might keep it at home. The public sphere should be kept neutral, universal, secular. And citizenship then rested on jus solis or jus domicile, meaning the right springing from living in a certain territory. Now, these are the two historical European models offered. And how well are we equipped with these two models to cope with our complex societies? Let's start with a cultural, ethnic nation first. If one insists on nation as a cultural unity, it is clear that in relation to this, immigrants always will have to play second fiddle. There's a demand for subordination. Strangers are, or as in German, we're called Gastarbeiter, guest workers. Of course, they are temporarily in the country. They are not supposed to stay on. Guests are supposed to leave at one point of time. And if they did stay on, they had to accept the rule of the host. So you had to accept the idea, what is in German is called Leitkultur, the leading culture, meaning that if there was a kind of conflict or collision between the majority culture and the minorities, then always the majority culture should have the right of way. And it's, to me, rather obvious that this kind of thinking is not able to cope with difference manifold in today's world. They're not able to find a formula for how various cultural ethnic groups may live together at the same territory. And then there's the political concept of the nation. And it also has some inherent problems, primarily because it's so bent on assimilation. And this way of reasoning claims that there should be a so-called neutral, universal, secular public sphere. But on closer inspection, we see that this is a quasi-universalism. In reality, it's biased in favor of the majority. I mean, to me, it's not a problem not being allowed to wear a hijab in French schools if I emigrated to France. But it is a problem for a young, devout Muslim wanting to show her belief in Allah. So, of course, assimilation, to my mind, is okay. I have no quibble, no problems with those who choose to assimilate, but I do think that an assimilation as a political project is not valid. I'll offer 4 reasons for that. First, migrations will continue, so it's not a once and for all operation. You have to live with difference all the time. And secondly, to demand that other people should become like us is a way of showing disrespect to them. And thirdly, what do we expect newcomers to assimilate into? And Norwegian culture is not a homogeneous unit. There are differences on sexual, moral, drinking habits, conceptions of nationality. And finally, if we insist and pressurize people to assimilation, I think we may expect a counter reaction, that people instead of participating, they withdraw and they develop rather defensive and also passive-aggressive positions. Now, the German philosopher Jürgen Habermas, he has suggested that identity and identification may be linked to democracy as a political form. He says what we should base on is the communicative society. This political communicative society is not built on a very dense or large bundle of values, but it's based on meta-values, on the meta-values on democracy and how to handle disagreement and how to handle values in conflict. And this view by Jürgen Habermas has been called Verfassungspatriotismus, as a patriotism linked to the constitution and its democratic meta-values. I think this is a very sympathetic way of thinking. However, if you stop there, I think it may become a bit too dry, a bit too super-rational, a bit too cerebral. Because there is also a need, along with this sort of intellectual adherence to the principles, there's also a need for a certain emotional warmth, making people want to make an effort, making people want to contribute, making people want to be able and participate in keeping up a society. And if nobody, so to speak, feels for a community as such, I think we are in serious trouble. Now, there is a third model offered, and in it, that is the idea about consequent multiculturalism. Now, multiculturalism is maybe understood in very many different ways, but here I present it in a very consequent, radical way, meaning that, so we have to think in principle about it, not just superficially. There are good arguments in favor of accepting several cultural collectives in the same territory. I'll give you some of the positive arguments. One is that, well, it's a question of justice. If I should have access to my culture, then others should have access to what they think are their culture. And then they may have the same right to claim support for the culture as I will claim for mine. Justice. And secondly, there is this bias built in any majority society with majority, that majority, they are ruling just by being the majority, just by this silent overweight that is always there. And then we may say that culture should not play a role, but this is not so. The culture of the majority of society will always be there. So denying cultural rights to one group is in de facto to say that the majority should rule. There are also serious problems with a radical consequent multiculturalism. First, what should constitute a collective that is recognized by the state? For instance, recognized perhaps as having a representation. Should that be religion, nationality, and also who should be recognized as speaking legitimately on behalf of the culture collective? The elders, the priests, why not young women? And how far should a collective have a right to control and steer the actions of the members? Should a member be free to leave a group? To my mind, obviously, there should be a right for exit. But on the other hand, should we have the society have the right to, the state have the right to prescribe that, for instance, women should have religious posts in all religious congregation? To my mind, this is not correct. Then we have to keep open the exit for those who do disagree with that. And also two more short questions about the problems of a radical consequent multiculturalism. If we only insist on difference, how should I recognize something similar, something of me in you? And if I do not recognize anything of me in you, why should I then see you as me, as a human being? This may sound a bit far-fetched in Norway today, perhaps, but look back a couple of decennia in European history, and you see how people have been not recognized as any human beings. And also insisting on difference, that does mean that we are not able to create a kind of collective subject, a kind of collective actor that transcends ethnic groups, that transcends various religions. For instance, how do we cope with creating a political subject that is strong enough to tackle all those challenges from global change and so on. So then, my way of thinking is that neither this radical version of multiculturalism, this consequent version insisting only on cultural collectives, only on difference, will be able to offer solutions to the world. So then the question raises, is it possible to imagine another way of thinking about nationality? Before I offer my sort of bid on that, I'll have to go into a very important question. most pertinent question when we speak about a new understanding of nation. And that is the following. How far is the kind of nation determined by history? How far are the existing nations, what political science people call path dependent? And the counter question, how far is it possible to consciously construct a nation? On this issue, there's been a prolonged and not perhaps very fertile debate between those who are called essentialists and those who are called constructivists. The first, the essentialists, they will see a nation as something having a very long history and a prehistory, which is still there. It's a historical core that transcends the centuries. It dates back very long back, and it's still active. Well, the latter, the constructivists, they will see nations as a kind of artifacts made by an elite of politicians and intellectuals, let's say from the mid-19th century. And if we go back to several European states, among them Norway, in the 19th century, well, we do see a clear conscious program, and we do see efforts for nation building, be it fairy tales or history writing, and so on and so forth. But on the other hand, these people who sort of wanted to construct or reconstruct a Norway, they had to build with real building blocks, real elements. They could not build just in the air without anything to build on and to build with. And they also had to build or come up with a program, a suggestion about what is the new Norway that had a resonance in the public. And this is exactly the same today. If we foresee some kind of nation building which is relevant, which is valid for the 21st century, we have to build with real building blocks, and we have to find a way of working with this that is accepted, find resonance in the population. So the task is the same for a 21st century nation building, with one very important difference, I think. The mid-19th century efforts, they were elite projects. And I think if there's any possibility of foreseeing a new way of thinking about nations, this has to be a task for all, not only for an elite. Now, let me then return to the theme of a possible rejuvenated nation. As you understand, I do not think nation states are stone dead. They are somehow alive. As a starter, is there a name for such a state? Well, we've spoken about kulturnation, political nation. We've spoken about multicultural nation. I have found no better provisional label than a nation as a unity in diversity. And then which elements that exist that may be included and used as building blocks. First, we have to think about who are, as the Norwegian constitution says, who are medlemmer av staten, who are the members of the state. And I think that will have to be those who live in the country. I think we have to have a jus solis principle, not a jus sanguinis, not the right of blood, not the right of ancestry. And then added to that, I think in a world where so many increasing number of people live transnational lives, we have to have a opening for a double citizenship, that you be a member of more than one state. This may sound peculiar in Norway, but I remind you that roughly half of the world's states accept double citizenships. I think it's time to raise that debate. And then further on, it means, of course, that we have to discard, we have to abandon the idea of a cultural nation built exclusively on the historical cultural heritage of the majority. But I do not mean that majority culture should disappear and should be irrelevant to the nation. Of course not. It will be dominating because of the mechanism I've spoken about. It also is legitimate, and it's got most valuable elements that have to be part of or Norway in the future as well. My point is not to eradicate the sagas, to eradicate the Norwegian flag and so on. My point is that you have to recognize the existence of and the rights of other culture in such a nation. And it does not necessarily imply that we say that cultural collectives have a kind of real existence, have a kind of essence that exists above peoples or outside people, individuals. But as I said, I think any individual should have the same possibility of access to what they understand as their own culture as the majority citizens. It is a matter of justice that as well as leikaring is supported, you should support, why not, Bhangra or Sufi dance. Thirdly, an important point, I think, a nation state should be seen as a kind of process. A nation is not a stable essence. A nation is a process where all elements may disappear, some continue, some are continuously added by impulses both from abroad and by people that move into the area. And this, as a process, that's the way a nation like Norway has been built historically. Christendom, technology in mines and manufacturing, urban and trade culture, you name it, has been brought to Norway by people who have come to this area. And I foresee that in the future there will be elements who come with immigrants as it did way back. Such a nation will of course contain greater differences than the years of homogeneity in the 20th century. There will be greater diversity, but hopefully also with the necessary elements of unity within the manifold. And some may think that this is purely wishful thinking. However, this is close to the American understanding of a nation when America is at its best, not at its worst, I must add. A fifth point, there have to be narratives, stories told about the nation, as stories have been told about previous types of states. There is a need for new national narratives about who we are, from where we came from, and in particular to where we are going. So what national narratives could be told? Well, one narrative might be the identification of the nation as cultural manifold, as Canada and to some extent US. Another narrative might be identifying the nation as the social nation, the nation where everyone has a stake in the country, no one is left outside or behind. And a third possible narrative is the idea of democracy as participation. As I said, in order for upholding rights, some will have to create the institutions that may do so, and then has to be a participation. I think there will be several narratives, several versions of the new Norway competing for hegemony, striving. There will be conflict around these versions. That we should take with quite calmly, because the conflict is not the problem. Indifference is the problem. If people say, well, we demand so and so, then there is a demand for being included, for being seen. But if people say, well, we do not think this society is for us, we turned our back on this society, we do not participate, then there is serious reason to be more scared. Of course, such a nation will not come just purely by idealistic formulas. There are certain prerequisites. It has to be built on real stakes in society, real memberships, and that will be political membership for all, participation, including an agreement on political unity to abide by democratic procedures. And secondly, there will have to be a social membership, that is equality and inclusion for all groups. And finally, there has to be a cultural membership, that is acceptance of cultural differences as an ordinary part of the nation. And each of these three memberships, they entail comprehensive programs. I shall not go into this now. A final remark then, and back to global citizenship. In the discussions on national states, on global governance, there is sometimes a premise suggested that there are only two alternatives in the world. Either we have to have supranational institutions, national governance, national management, or there have to be sovereign singular states which only pursue their self-interest. Either or. However, I think states may, in enlightened self-interest, bind themselves to international agreements, and so they do. States may seek cooperation within the United Nations and they may work for new fields to be included in the UN system. For instance, that the trade should not be run through the World Trade Organization, which is bent only on free trade. It should be run by EU and related organizations that accept labor rights and environmental consequences to count. And then finally, the citizens, the people, they do seek cooperation transcending borders. There are not only global managers from above, there's also popular internationalism, be it peace movements, transnational trade unions, global networks among women, environmentalists. There is an international or indigenous people, and there are NGOs that are not only self-serving, there are social movements. So this strength for popular internationalism, it varies. Its flame has flickered, but it has never died. And in popular internationalism, and in nation, then understood as unity in manifold, here lies, to me, the alternative to self-appointed global governance. Thank you.